Welcome to A Roaster's Guide to Coffee Plant Types. I'm your host today. My name is Chris Kornman. I am the Lab and Education Manager at The Crown. The Crown is located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, California. We're a lab and tasting room, as well as an event space and education center. You can read more about us online. Royal Coffee is the parent company of The Crown, family-owned and operated importer in business since 1978 in the Bay Area. And you are on our website right now. Today's class will cover a number of topics related to the botany of the coffee plant, specifically related to classification. We'll look at the terms of variety and cultivar and dissect different subcategories, including landraces, selections, heirloom varieties, mutations, hybrids, how hybrid breeding works, and look at the plasticity of coffee. Café Arabica has evolved dramatically over the course of history, rising from humble under canopy trees growing in wild in the forests of Keffa in western Ethiopia and South Sudan's Boma Plateau into a globally traded agricultural product. As with the difference between a Valencia and a blood orange, the specific type of coffee can impact a plant's morphology, that's its physical appearance, its annual yield, its resistance to disease, and of course its flavor. The following two terms, often used interchangeably in coffee, are actually completely distinct in the language of horticulture: variety and cultivar. I was lucky to consult with a colleague, Izzy Aspera, who helped to clarify the two for me. Izzy told me, varieties often occur in nature, and most varieties are true to type. That means that seedlings grown from a variety will also have the same unique characteristics of the parent plant. Cultivars are not true to type. They're usually heavily controlled hybrids and must be propagated by cuttings, tissue culture, and grafting. These two terms are both very divisive in describing how a plant grows. Both variety and cultivar are a taxonomic rank below species, but a variety occurs naturally and clones itself readily from seed. Typica and Bourbon would be examples of varieties. Conversely, a cultivar must be propagated by human intervention. Catamor and Castillo are examples of cultivars. The word cultivar itself is just a mashup of cultivated variety, a term coined by Cornell University's Liberty Hyde Bailey in 1923, who proposed, quote, cultivar for a botanical variety for a race subordinate to species that has originated under cultivation. It is not necessarily, however, referable to a recognized botanical species. It is essentially the equivalent of the botanical variety except in respect to its origin, end quote. There's one other term, varietal, that's occasionally been used informally and sometimes formally in the coffee community, usually interchangeably with variety, but the two don't actually mean the same thing. Variety is a botanical term and it's a noun. Varietal was born as an adjective, meaning, quote, having the characteristics of a variety. Nowadays, usage of varietal as a noun occurs most frequently in the wine world, referring to the beverage made from a single botanical variety. So, Pinot Noir, for example, would be a variety of grape, but a varietal of wine. That is, the wine has the variety characteristics of the variety grape. To put it another way, you can drink a varietal that has the characteristics of the variety you've planted and harvested. It's a relatively minor distinction, but one that does make a big difference if we're trying to be precise. You are drinking a varietal cup of Bourbon, which was picked from the Bourbon variety tree. A wild variety, like those found in the coffee forests across Ethiopia, can be referred to as a landrace. This is a term that carries a few important distinctions. Landraces are generally considered to be domesticated, but also locally adapted, and they are distinct from any formal breeding or selection. Thus, both a wild forest coffee and a traditional home garden in, say, Ethiopia or Yemen could be growing a landrace variety, for example. Oftentimes, landraces, natural variations in a field, or offspring in a breeding program are chosen for further breeding, cloning, or wider dissemination. This process is called selection. Kent is a selection from a single rust-resistant tree on a plantation in India. Gesha was selected from a limited number of seeds in a wild population in western Ethiopia, for example. Sometimes, when making a selection for a gene bank or breeding program, botanists will borrow the library science term accession, which simply means a single unique sample. The term heirloom has often been applied to Ethiopian forest coffees, and more broadly to global varieties like Typica and Bourbon. Many plant growers now use heirloom as a marketing term, though the word more directly relates to family artifacts passed down through generations. As a result, the agricultural definition of heirloom is both contested and inconsistent. In one sense, it could broadly be used to refer to any variety that is not crossed with another strain. Since Arabica can reproduce through open pollination, that is, by the natural spread of pollen from a flower's stamen to stigma by a bird or the wind or by hand, Bourbon, Typica, Caturra, and Mocha could all be considered a type of heirloom variety. However, more strictly, most plant breeders and gardeners use heirloom to refer to non-commercial fruits and vegetables, and frequently mark a point in history, usually World War II, as the cutoffs. In the 1940s and 50s, monoculture commercial breeds became increasingly important in global agriculture. Thus, an heirloom plant is often a private home garden reaction against this type of macro farming, frequently passed down generationally, just like a family heirloom. In this sense, relatively few coffee varieties would qualify. Ultimately, heirloom seems insufficiently precise and far too confusing to be of practical use when discussing a variety of coffee, in my opinion. In its place, I think our best options remain landrace for locally adapted varieties in the field in places like Ethiopia and Yemen. And then outside of these countries, when describing varieties like Bourbon, Caturra, or Mocha, for example, variety continues to be the most precise term. In place of heirloom, perhaps using the word traditional or legacy might better convey the historic importance of these particular plant types. Caturra and Mocha are also examples of mutations. These are genetic anomalies that change something significant about a plant's nature. In the case of Mocha, the genetic mutation resulted in very small spherical berries and seeds. In a sense, nearly all naturally occurring varieties began as a mutation that was then passed down through generations. Many cultivated mutations are also selected at some point in their history, isolating, preserving, and reproducing their unique genetic code. For more than a century, Typica was the exclusive variety grown worldwide outside of Ethiopia and Yemen. Bourbon, genetically very similar to Typica, provided little relief to the relative monoculture of cultivated coffee. Furthermore, Arabica can self-pollinate, meaning that its seeds will often be clones of the parent tree. This bottleneck of genetic diversity created some significant problems, including susceptibility to disease and climate change. One way to improve diversity is to crossbreed varieties and species. In contrast to traditional varieties and mutations, a hybrid refers to a unique plant bred from a cross-pollinated or lab-induced blend of at least two distinct genetic parents. Naturally occurring hybrids are not rare for coffee, since cross-pollination occurs readily with other nearby trees. Hybrids created in labs are commonly bred for disease resistance or improved yield, for example. Because hybrids contain unique genetic material contributed from two separate populations, they are said to have hybrid vigor, or increased genetic diversity. When a breeder selects a particular accession from a child population for a unique genetic trait, a hybrid can be crafted to retain the desirable characteristics of its parents and propagate new cultivars. Hybrids themselves have a number of unique subcategories. Intra-specific hybrids are bred from parents of the same species. Mundo Novo is a spontaneous intraspecific hybrid of two traditional Arabica varieties, for example. On the other hand, interspecific hybrids are a cross of multiple species. The Timor hybrid is perhaps the most famous interspecific hybrid of Coffea, Arabica, and Robusta, also known as Canephora. Interspecific hybrids can also be referred to as introgressed, which means that new genetic material was introduced. Castillo and Ruru 11 are examples of introgressed varieties. Both are Arabica plants that contain a little bit of genetic material introduced from Robusta. A hybrid of two distinct varieties will result in relatively uniform offspring. Dominant genes will express in most of the first generation. Breeders refer to this first cross generation as filial and designate each generation subsequently with a number. Centro Americano, for example, is an F1, or a first filial generation hybrid, meaning it is a direct descendant of its two parents, a Sarchamore and a Sudan Rumé. However, if the parent plants themselves are hybrid, the F1 generation siblings might result in a composite with complex genetic variation built into the fabric of the cultivar's genetic code. Castillo and Ruiru 11 are both composites. The seeds in a bag of Castillo will not produce identical trees. F1 plants are not stable for reproductive purposes. Breeding two identical F1s together will result in genetic rearrangement where a sizable minority of the offspring will display a mix of traits from recessive genes or revert to expressions of the original parents. The more genetic variation in the parent plants, the less stable the F2 generation will be. Creating a stable offspring usually requires selecting and breeding down to the fourth or fifth generations. For many coffees, the fifth generation F5s are considered relatively stable, but still not quite 100%. Most Castillo plants are F5 or fifth filial generation plants. Lab-crafted hybrids are often back-crossed with the parent plant to reinforce a particular genetic trait like disease resistance or seed size. The example in front of you on the left, we have parent plant A, the donor, which possesses a single desired trait, in this case, the purple fruit. And parent plant B, which we call recurrent, and it provides the genetic base for the plant type for that trait's introduction. In a typical back-crossing scenario, plant A will have a characteristic that the breeder wants to introduce into the makeup of plant B. An F1 hybrid of the parents will be created, and that hybrid will then be back-crossed with the recurrent parent plant B. The next offspring is then selected for the gene marker from parent A, in this case that purple seed, and then back-crossed again, repeating the process, occasionally self-pollinating the generations until the seedlings are a stable, uniform cultivar that expresses mostly parent plant B's characteristics, but with that new genetic material from parent plant A included. Varieties in cultivars, even ones that are supposed to be the same, like two F1 hybrids from the same parents, can still adapt differently to local environmental conditions. Recent work by University of Michigan alum Stephanie Alcala showed three distinct phenotypes, those would be observed characteristics like appearance and growth patterns, in Gesha trees on Haciendula Esmeralda, including a dwarf morphology. This adaptability is referred to as plasticity. From Lily Kubota and Daily Coffee News, quote, Price Peterson and Alcala found that morphological differences of Gesha plants are not driven solely by genetic variables, but rather a combination of genetic variations and phenotypic plasticity related to how plants cope with variations in environment, and discovered a wide range of genetic variation existing within the cultivar. The team also identified significant genetic variation in the Gesha dwarf, with one Gesha dwarf sample seeming to be more closely related to the sampled Catuai cultivars than other Geshas in the study. There's a quote within the quote. It was a really exciting project to work on because it showcased how scientists are able to utilize advancing technology, in this case next generation DNA sequencing, and apply it to industries such as specialty coffee, which would have been unheard of 20 years ago, said Alcala. We're living in a unique time in the history of coffee and technology. While the words, photos, and informational graphics in this presentation are my original work, I wouldn't have been able to create them without relying on a number of external sources. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge Roast Magazine's online resource, Daily Coffee News, where this work was first published. Lily Kubota and Nick Brown have been generous with their time and energy and have made excellent editors to my work. This piece, as well as many others which first ran in DCN, can also be found republished with permission on the Royal Coffee blog. Finally, you can also see listed here a number of sources, either quoted directly or referred to in citation throughout the piece, and I'd encourage you to check them as additional resources. They're all interesting in their own right. This concludes the Roaster's Guide to Coffee Plant Types and serves as a precursor to the next guide, which will dive deeply into specific cultivars, their origins and their appearances, and in some cases their quality implications. I'd encourage you to check that out as well. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.